I'm going to be lecturing today primarily on the period of time from about 1789 to about 1795, which there's a lot that happens in that 6-year time span. We go from seeing basically an absolutist style government in France, where you have Louis XVI, who is the unquestioned monarch, and his wife Marie Antoinette, to kind of a quasi constitutional monarchy to more or less a military dictatorship under under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre. And so I'm sorry, I'm trying to, hopefully that doesn't screw anything up. All right, I just left the previous Hangout thing that I started, so hopefully everybody's in the proper one right now. Okay, so let me continue here with what we were talking about. Where we left off in class today was we were talking about how the Third Estate starts to call themselves the National Assembly. They literally basically disregard their Third Estate status. They say, we are France. We are the people who are going to create a new constitution for the nation. And France, you might call this the Montesquieu era of the French Revolution, because what they try and do is basically set up a constitutional monarchy in the same sort of fashion that, to an extent, or an attempt to make it the same sort of constitutional monarchy that England has. Of course, France doesn't have a history of constitutionalism. They've been an absolute state by this point for well over a century. And so the constitutional sentiments that they're trying to institute during the National Assembly do not end up coming to fruition in the same way that they're implemented or executed during or in Britain at any given time. So we finished class today talking about the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille being the medieval prison that was in the heart of Paris, where they stormed the Bastille to find gunpowder. A number of people die in the riots, and they start tearing down the Bastille brick by brick. This happens in July 14th of 1789. You don't have to worry about checking in here to start. I have a screenshot of who's in here to begin with, so I can tell right now we have 30 some people watching. So I know who's here and who isn't, but I will need to check in at the end. So don't worry about like saying here or not. Let's continue after what happens at the Bastille with an era that was known as the Great Fear, not to be confused with the Reign of Terror. The Great Fear was when the revolution, which to this point had pretty much been isolated in Paris, extends to the countryside, and peasants start attacking the manor houses of their feudal lords in an effort basically to destroy any records of their tenancy on the land and their feudal obligations. There are a few instances of buildings being burned down. There's a few instances of peasants, like it's like the old school, like pick up a pitchfork and start freaking out in the countryside. Sort of, it kind of conjures those types of images. A number of middle-class owners were also under attack at this time, and the enclosure system, which didn't really take off as prominently in France as it had in England, they had attempted in the years just before the French Revolution started to build these enclosures in a somewhat similar fashion as some of the landholders in England had done. And so they undo some of those enclosures. Old common lands that they had wiped out by making these enclosures are reoccupied by the French peasants in some cases. Forests were seized, and a number of taxes started to go unpaid. So this is the Great Fear, where we're starting to see the revolt move from the urban area of Paris, which is one of the most populous urban areas in Europe at this time, out to the French countryside, of which there's a good number, or a good amount. By August 4th, all of feudalism was abolished, and by the National Assembly, which had previously been the Third Estate, as I mentioned before. And they declared equality of taxation for all classes. Now this makes up what I would call basically one of two major changes of the revolution, the other one being the abolition of the guild system, which was not unlike kind of family economy in a way. Well, but family economy kind of more takes place in rural areas. The guild system is still more of an urban type phenomenon. But it ends serfdom, even though serfdom was much more widespread in Eastern Europe and not as widespread in France. What remaining serfdom there was in France ends, and they also ended the exclusive hunting rights for nobles. They ended the corvée, which was that manual labor that the peasants were required to do for so many days a year, and various other dues, but like banalities and things like that. One of the major documents that comes out of August 1789 is a document known and modeled actually after our own kind of, it's kind of modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and it's also kind of modeled after the Bill of Rights in a way. And it's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And what this document does is it sets up a framework for what constitutionalism is roughly going to look like in France. You can think of it as like a constitutional blueprint of sorts. It's based very heavily on the Enlightenment, as was our own Constitution, and to a lesser extent the Declaration of Independence here in the United States. But this document is called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They call for freedom of religion, or at least the expression of religion, freedom of speech. Taxes could be raised only with common consent. So that's again a very Rousseau type idea, where you're trying to introduce policies that are going to be for the general will of the population, right? But again, we're still in the Montesquieu era. I don't want to confuse you. We're not in the Rousseau Republic era yet. We're in the Montesquieuian era, because remember, they're doing this Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen for the purposes of creating a permanent constitutional monarchy. And while I should mention, while what's one of the most notable things about the French Revolution, of course, is that they eventually get rid of their monarchy entirely. They get rid of Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette. They are literally both executed. That during this time, they still had intentions of keeping the king intact, much the same way that in Britain the king remained intact, even though you had a parliamentary body which had shown via the Glorious Revolution in 1688 or 1689 that it had more power. It had literally so much power it could choose who it wants to be on the throne, and that was demonstrated by their taking James II off the throne and replacing James II with his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, who became William III, the first of the Hanoverian kings in England. And so it's kind of weird, because you have this kind of Dutch-German guy who's running England as the king. Another thing that the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen does is that all public servants are accountable for conduct in office. There was a separation of powers. Again, that's a very Montesquieu idea, through separate branches of government. So trying to institute, like a um, what you call it, a judicial, legislative, executive type branch. And then also they confiscate property from private, confiscation of property from private persons had to be done with fair compensation. So in other words, you couldn't just take people's land without paying them for it. You had to properly compensate them for the valuation of that land. And then citizen applied to all French people regardless of class. And that's a big deal because we think of citizen here in the United States as being something that's pretty liberally given out. We all think of ourselves, even those of us maybe who weren't necessarily born in the United States, or our parents weren't born in the United States, and we came over here and settled and migrated from a different location. Particularly if you are here from the time that you're very young and you come up through the American school system and you speak English and you more or less consider yourself an American citizen. Now, of course, there is a technical thing about American citizenship where, you know, a person cannot just come here and call themselves a citizen. They're, you know, naturalized citizenship is something that a person has to go through a process to earn. If you're born here, like I was, you automatically have citizenship. Anyone who's born on U.S. soil is given citizenship. This is something that we think of as a pretty like liberal policy, right? All you have to do is be born somewhere in U.S. territory and you are considered a citizen of the United States. Even if your parents were literally on vacation and you happen to be born during that time, you are born on American soil, you are an American citizen. The reason I'm talking about this so much is because the concept of citizenry, going all the way back to ancient Greece, is not a liberal policy. Citizenship was reserved for, even in early American times, not everyone that was born here was considered a citizen. That's the way that it is today. But early on, really the only people who were considered citizens were white, adult males who owned land, and that's a pretty exclusive group of people. So already you've eliminated 50% of your population by not allowing women proper citizenship. And when I say that, what I really mean is that, like, you know, when we think of the you know, the whole like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that's one thing that kids a lot of times kind of have a hard time wrapping their head around, because when Tommy Jefferson wrote that line, he was really not referring to women. He certainly wasn't referring to slaves. He really wasn't referring to anyone who didn't own land. And so it's kind of like, well, why did he even say that at all? And that's because for him, in his historical discourse, those people don't even cross his mind as, like, you know, as being people who would have been entitled those types of things. It's not even in the realm of his thinking. Going all the way back to ancient Greece, citizens were people who could vote. A Roman citizen was a person who was, you know, more or less patrician. You had patricians and plebeians, or plebeians, and there were a whole lot of lands where the Rome controlled. But just because you lived on Roman-controlled land or were born on Roman-controlled land, you didn't get citizenship. And in France, the third estate, prior to this whole French Revolution, really would not have been considered citizens. They didn't have political power. They weren't allowed to participate in office. They weren't allowed to hold high positions in government or military. They weren't allowed to hold high positions in the church. Many of them were very restricted in terms of the types of commerce that they could engage in. And so, you know, citizenship in terms of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, when we say the word citizen and apply it to all French people, regardless of class, that's a substantial change from the way that it was before. So I'm sorry to take like 10 minutes to explain that whole topic, but it is substantial. There's been a couple of questions here, so let me go back and answer a few of them. Bowen says, wasn't France still absolutist during Louis XVI rule? Why couldn't he use the army to control the peasants if he sided with the nobles? Well, that's a good question. First of all, one of the reasons that the whole Parisian revolt takes place, the storming of the Bastille and stuff, is because they are scared of that very thing. Louis XVI had hired a number of Swiss guards. He had, there were rumors that he was threatening to use the military. He wasn't, probably. At least it wasn't shown that nothing demonstrates that he had any intention, because he didn't really, I don't think, know the extent of what was going on in Paris on the day that it happened. But there were rumors that he was going to use the military to suppress them and so on. The main fact of the matter is that you have a military who becomes increasingly kind of disloyal, I guess you would say, and he begins having to use mercenaries, basically, for his protection. And so we'll talk more about that in a few minutes here, but that's in a short answer to that. It says, just out of curiosity, is there supposed to be a PowerPoint being shown? No, there is not. I'm not showing the PowerPoint right now. And also, does the end of absolutism in France end due to the constitutional change of the Rousseau era? Most of absolutism in other states, such as... Okay, wait. Does the end of absolutism in France end due to the constitutional change of the Rousseau era? And most... Okay, one second. Let me restate that. Does the end of absolutism in France lead to a failure or end of absolutism in other states such as Russia? That's a great question. Okay. Short answer, yes, but it takes time. It doesn't happen right away. And one of the whole reasons that there's this War of the First Coalition that happened starting in 1792, after the National Assembly says, okay, here's the Constitution, it's done, and we're now going to change our name and have a new election and call ourselves the Legislative Assembly, that there's a war that happens in that same year, within that same year time span, that breaks out. Because what happens is that while the rest of Europe looks over to France and says, oh, great, France is kind of like weakened because they've got a whole bunch of political turmoil and stuff like that. France had been such a dominant military and commercial power for so long that kind of people in other states are looking at this like, oh, this is our chance to maybe bolster our own power. But interestingly, what happens is that a number of other states start to become really concerned, because they think, whoa, wait a second, if absolutism is ending there, and that revolution is toppling the system of absolute monarchy, what if that spreads to Eastern Europe? And so there's a whole war that happens to try to contain the revolutionary threat that starts up in France, and we'll talk about a little bit about that later. Louis XVI probably tried, but the third estate was still the largest section, so it was probably feudal. Yeah, that's a good answer. Okay. What about the rights of women? Women gained increased rights to divorce, to inherit property, to get child support from their fathers, particularly for illegitimate children at this time. And so, believe it or not, the French Revolution brings some degree of elevation of rights, but I do not want to make the case, much like in the American Declaration of Independence, when we're talking about citizenry here, we are not making men and women equal citizens. Okay, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen did not give women equal rights in France. When women start to gain equal rights, and even, to be honest, we're not 100% there today, as evidenced by the fact that women in equal position jobs, in the private sector particularly, even at CEO high-level positions, only make like 80% or 70% or something of what a male in the same position would make. So we're even not all the way there with gender equality. But the thing that starts to give women like the right to vote and so on and so forth, that does not come. The whole feminist movement well, feminism comes even later, but there's a whole suffragette movement, suffragist movement that comes in the early 1900s, the early 20th century, and that continues throughout the century, and it has a lot to do with women's contributions in World War I and II, and that it also extends to what we would call the feminist movement, which really doesn't roll around until the 1970s. So it's really, that's an important point to make. It is really, there's a term that we use for it called anachronistic. If you want to hear a great whatever GRE term, anachronism or anachronistic. What an anachronism is when you're talking about something that doesn't fit into the time period. So if you say, oh yeah, Mary Wollstonecraft was a feminist, feminism didn't happen in the 1790s when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her Vindication of the Rights of Women. It happened in the 1970s. So you literally have to switch like 1790s, 1970s. So anachronism is when you talk like, it'd be like, oh yeah, King Louis the 16th posted to Twitter. That doesn't make any sense because Twitter didn't exist and then neither did the internet. And so anachronism. All right, I got to keep moving because I can't stop talking. All right, here we go. At this point, very, very, very few people, even a lot of women, didn't believe in gender equality. Women could not hold office. Women, were not given the advantage in family law. They were not given an advantage in education. They were not given an advantage in property rights or inheritance rights or any of those things. While their rights may have been elevated slightly, they were certainly nowhere near equal to what a man had. And so it's still very much a patriarchal society. So there was this woman, there is a notable female figure, Olympe de Gouges, or Gouges, Olympe de Gouges, and her last name is spelled D-E, Day, Gouges, and I'm not French, so I'm probably butchering that name, Olympe de Gouges. And she wrote a piece, very similar character to Mary Wollstonecraft. In fact, they're kind of contemporaries of one another. And she wrote a piece called The Rights of Women in 1791, basically taking each of the 17 articles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and applying them to women's rights and so on. And so Olympe de Gouges in her book says, here's how this would look if we took the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Notice it's not the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, and said, okay, they should be asserted the right to divorce under certain conditions. Sorry, somebody just called me. I know that's odd that I just hung up on them, but I can almost guarantee it's a telemarketer because no one knows what phone number that is. So anyway, asserted the right to divorce under certain conditions, to control property in marriage, equal access to higher education and civilian careers and public employment, and so on. Hang on one second here. I have to check to make sure that I'm not missing an important phone call. Okay, I'm good to go. Sorry about that. Here we go. Mary Wollstonecraft, Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Again, very, very similar book title name. She defends de Gouges' ideas. There was another woman by the name of Madame de Stael, and her name is Madame, M-A-D-A-M-E, Day, D-E-S-T-A-E-L, Stael, or Stel. And Madame de Stael is a woman not unlike, actually, Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin, who ran a salon and was good friends with Denis Diderot. Madame de Stael ran a salon as well. She wrote many widely read books, and she also opposed the subordination of women that the revolution did relatively little to change. So women were still very firmly kept in their social position subordinate to men. By October 5th, 1789, you have women taking on a very important role in the French Revolution. It's probably one of the most incredible parts of the revolution, and it's called the Women's March to Versailles. And it's these kind of these are no women to joke with. These are women who worked on the fish docks all day long, moving and carting around crates of fish and other things. They are strong working women, and they become outraged at the price of bread, and that was one of the major economic factors that we talked about leading to things. Well, bread shortages are reaching critical lows by the time that we get to 1789, thanks to a number of really cold winters in France that caused a bunch of crops to fail. So by the time they get to 1789, you've got this group of women, and remember, it's the woman's job a lot of times to go to market and purchase these things for the family and so on, and they're by the docks, and there's a bunch of markets around there, and basically they march. This group of fearsome fish ladies marches out to Versailles with the intention of murdering Marie Antoinette. And they get there. This was in part incited by the guy that I told you about before by the name of Jean-Paul Marat. And Jean-Paul Marat had this paper called The People's Friend, which translates to something in French that I can't pronounce. And this was a very inflammatory news periodical that people read to get all riled up. And it blames the king for all of these economic, and queen for all these economic grievances. Now, one of the things that that Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Queen of France, bride to Louis XVI, had gotten a nickname for herself. She had earned a nickname for herself. They called her Madame Deficit. Deficit, if you know what a deficit is, that means that you're spending more each year than you're collecting in revenue. And so this was in part incited by Jean-Paul Marat. 7,000 women march out to Versailles with their fish knives in hand, ready to cut the throat of Marie Antoinette. I mean, it must have been quite a sight to see. And they get out there. There's a couple of Swiss guards guarding the door of the Palace of Versailles. They cut their heads off, and they start storming the palace to go and find Marie Antoinette. Well, fortunately for Miss Antoinette, or Marie Antoinette, she was nowhere to be found in the entire palace. They go to her chambers and her bed chambers, and they take the mattress and they use their fish knives and cut up the mattress and throw the stuffing everywhere. And by that point, they've kind of like worn themselves out. And rather than when they actually do locate the king and queen, they don't kill them, and they kind of cooled their jets a little bit, and they take the king and queen prisoner, and they march them all the way back to Paris. And the king and queen of France never would stay another night in Versailles again. That was the last time that they were in Versailles. And from there on out, they live in a palace called Tuileries Palace. It's spelled Tuilerie, I think, Tuileries, maybe IES, Tuileries Palace. And Tuileries Palace is no longer there. It burned down several years later. I want to say about 100 years later, maybe just under 100 years later, it burned down. So you can't go to Tuileries Palace anymore. But they were basically, it was a smaller palace, and they spent the rest of their days there pretty much until they're thrown in prison. So women invaded the royal apartments. They slaughtered some bodyguards and searched for Queen Marie Antoinette, but they could not find her. And there's a picture here. I can quickly show you this picture. It's a great image. And I wish, you know, it's too bad that cameras weren't invented just a little bit earlier, because this is the sort of thing that would have just been awesome to see photographs of what this actually looked like when it was happening. But I'll show you the PowerPoint here. So here is an image of the actual march to the Palace of Versailles. Here's the fearsome fish ladies. Like I told you, they have these things here called pikes. They have these kind of tall sword with axe things on them. Those are called halberds. They're bringing a cannon with them, and they're marching to find Marie Antoinette. This woman's holding a saber. Look at this. She's got a larger arm than I do. Okay, this woman could probably bench press more than I can, and I'm not joking about that. But anyway, that's the fearsome fish ladies. So let's continue. So that was the Women's March to Versailles. The king and queen live in Tuileries Palace, and then we move into the year 1790. So that's the year 1789 when everything goes down really crazy in France. There was the creation of the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790. The civil constitution of the clergy basically, for lack of a better word, secularized religion. It basically made the church basically like a state office. It wouldn't have been very unlike the Department of Transportation or something like that. It becomes its own state entity. And so the civil constitution of the clergy creates a national church with 83 bishops and dioceses. One might argue that this was one of the biggest mess ups or screw ups of the National Assembly. Because the French people are traditionally very Catholic, and even though there was like Gallicanism and stuff like that, the tradition in France was Catholicism. And there's an important point to be made about that, and that is that your peasantry, not unlike your nobility, on a social level, has a tendency to be pretty traditional. They don't like radical changes. Your peasants are going to be pretty like, let's keep, especially things like religion that we're really comfortable with and that we know really well. You know, they're going to be pro-Catholic. They're going to be pro-Catholicism. So taking and radically changing around the religious institutions of the country of France was something that they were averse to. They did not want it to happen. And so they actually lose, the revolution loses a little bit of peasant support because of the changes that they're making to the religious institutions. And this remains relatively true today. If you think about like the most religious parts of the country have a tendency to also be the most conservative parts of the country here in the United States even. And so and I'm not calling like them peasants or anything like that, but it does have a tendency for people of lower income, and you know, just speaking broadly about states that are lower income average states and so on, they have a tendency to be a little bit more pro-religion, a little bit more traditional, a little bit more conservative. And the same was true of France at this time, where you have the peasants who are going to be pro-Catholicism because it's tradition. So the clergy become basically paid state offices of the church. So you have like clergy members who are paid like a state official would have been paid. But Protestants, Jews, and agnostics could legally take part in the elections based on citizenship and property qualifications. And the clergy, not unlike government officials, have to take an oath and swear loyalty to the state. So that's kind of odd when you think about like how powerful Catholicism was in France, and how you have the whole hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church from the Pope straight on down to the laity. That these people are made to, these clergy members are made to take a state oath to swear loyalty, like a pledge of allegiance to the French state. The Pope condemned the French Revolution, clearly, which is not a surprise, and so they didn't want people swearing their loyalty to the Pope, who was considered a foreign entity. Chris just asked, can you explain the clubs in the French Revolution, like the Jacobins and the Girondins? I can, and I'm going to get to that. We just haven't gotten there yet, but we're getting pretty close. The result of the civil constitution of the clergy, just to speak to that, is that the civil constitution of the clergy makes France really divided over the issue of religion. Half of French priests basically refuse to accept it. They're called the refractory clergy. Most of the peasants, the urban working class, the king, some former aristocrats, because remember, they basically got rid of all nobility privileges, so you can't really call them nobles anymore. They're former nobles, or they're formal aristocrats, are people who would have supported the refractory clergy, who refused to accept the civil constitution of the clergy. So France becomes a constitutional monarchy with what was known as a unicameral legislative body. The middle class controlled the government through an indirect method of voting. Basically, about half of all males were eligible to vote. The nobility was abolished. And the National Assembly takes and divides France into 83 departments that were governed by elected officials. The new system of laws, the new legislative system, and these courts around these different departments basically gives France a unified administrative structure, which is something that they really needed, because I just clicked on a wrong button. They really needed it. One of the major complaints of the French prior to this time was that you had kind of an uneven administration of justice around the country, depending on where you were, especially if you were in far southern France and really removed from Versailles. More or less, the nobles down there could kind of operate their territory kind of how they wanted to. The one weakness of this is that local communities kind of enforce national legislation at their discretion. So if you think about this, it brings a certain predictability to it, but the extent to which they're practicing this the way that they should be is maybe a little bit limited. Economic reform favored the middle class rather than the lower class. One of the major things that you need to consider about the French Revolution is that this is very much a bourgeois-driven revolution. The bourgeoisie, the educated kind of upper middle class, are the people who benefit most in this revolution. This is not a peasant rebellion. This is not something that's meant to elevate so much the status of the peasantry as it is to elevate the status of the middle class. They adopt the metric system. There was a law passed called the Le Chapelier Law. The Le Chapelier Law was in 1791, which outlawed strikes, outlawed worker coalitions, outlawed assemblies, outlawed monopolies, outlawed tariffs, and this is a demonstration of that classical liberal economic idea of hands-off government, or hands-off the economy, laissez-faire, that I've been talking about in class, where basically the idea is let the economy do what it will do, rather than putting all these restrictions on it, which is again one of the major tenets of the revolution in the first place. Assignats. Assignats are spelled A-S-S-I-G-N, just like an assignment, but it ends with A-T-S, so assignats. Became the new paper currency. So they're instituting a more predictable currency system. Former church property, because remember, the civil constitution of the clergy makes the church an extension of the state. So the church lands now are state lands, means that former church property was used to guarantee the value of the assignats. And so in case you're wondering, like, why did people start using assignats? What backed their value? Because people realize, like, this is just a piece of paper. What is this worth? the value of it was backed by the land that they took from the church. And then church land was sold to pay off all that national debt that they had from the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. And who buys it? Peasants. Okay, here is where Louis XVI loses the majority of his influence. There is something called the Flight to Varennes. Varennes. The Flight to Varennes is when Louis XVI attempts to flee France, which was understandable because the situation is getting very tenuous. I mean, he's been taken out of Versailles and he is being held basically in a prisoner in Tuileries Palace. Not that, I mean, he's still living in a palace, but he's on a short leash. And so what he does is he puts on this kind of like goofy disguise. They escape they try to escape in the middle of the night. This is June 10th, 1791. And I think part of Louis XVI is hoping that if he goes to like a place outside of Paris and they see him, they'll be like, oh, it's the king. And then like magically they'll just like change all their minds and be like, oh, it's the king. We'll bring him back and we'll make him the... So he gets caught. He gets stopped by some guards in Varennes, which is right on the border, the eastern border of France. And he's leaving because he didn't want to approve the Constitution that the National Assembly was right on the verge of passing, because they're going to force him to sign it, and he knows that they're going to force him to sign it. So in order to avoid signing it, he says, well, why don't we go to my wife's home country of Austria? And I've told you before that the French, for the last couple of hundred years, have not gotten along particularly well with the Austrians. They hate them. And so when the king of their country, the monarch of France, tries to flee to go to nearby Austria, the people freak out. And they say, this guy's abandoning us. And he's a traitor. And, you know, the reason that he was going over there was going to try to raise a counter-revolutionary army that he could have brought back to Paris to conquer the revolution. And so he gets captured, and they bring him back to Paris, and he basically becomes a prisoner of the Parisian mobs. And at that very point, he is forced to sign the new Constitution. All right, there's a guy that you should be aware of. His name is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is a conservative. And Edmund Burke lived from 1729 to 1797. So, excuse me, by the time that he writes this piece in 1791, he's quite old. He's only a few years away from death. And he's considered one of the great intellectual defenses of, or the defenders of European conservatism. Conservatism is a term, if we're conservative, that means we're kind of traditional in our values, and we want things to stay more or less the way that they are, status quo, right? Keep things the same. And he defends the idea of inherited privileges like nobility, especially of the English monarchy and aristocracy or aristocratic class. And he predicted that basically the way that things were going in France in 1790, literally this piece that he writes is known as, it's entitled Reflections on the Revolutions in France. And what he says in this piece is that there's going to be anarchy and dictatorships in France. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what ends up happening. Meanwhile, over here in the United States, actually, so this is 1790, and one second, I just want to check something really fast. make sure that my internet's showing I'm losing connection here. So I'm going to refresh this. Uh-oh. Hopefully you guys have been able to see me. Okay, well, can you guys see this here? Somebody say something in the box, because I can't tell if you guys can actually see me right now or not, because it's saying that my internet connection is bad. There's like a 30-second delay here. Video quality is poor. Okay, I apologize for that. Okay, well, I'm going to continue because I did get responses, so I just wanted to make sure that it hadn't hung up here. So here we go. Thomas Paine was the guy that I was just about to bring up. So in America, actually, technically, Thomas Paine was born in England, but we'll call him American. There's an American dude named Thomas Paine, and he writes a piece called Rights of Man. And Thomas Paine Thomas Paine writes this piece, and it's a response to Burke's argument by defending the Enlightenment principle. So leave it to an American to defend the Enlightenment, right? And it's kind of a poignant thing because you know, the American Revolution very much inspired the French Revolution, and America and France are very close in the early parts of the in the early years of America. And so Thomas Paine responds to Burke's argument, which is like, oh, they're getting rid of the old system, and the whole thing's going to collapse, and it's going to be a nightmare, and it's going to turn into a dictatorship, and this is so evil and wrong and bad. And Thomas Paine comes out and is like, no, this is the glory of the Enlightenment coming through to fruition, and it's a triumph over the evil despots of France, and so on. So it's like a really neat argument that they have during the French Revolution, a very philosophical argument that's taking place in like two different disparate regions of the globe about reactions to the French Revolution. So we're like, American French Revolution, they're freaking out over here, and then England's like, no, we're traditional and we want to keep their the monarchy in place, and that's the very traditional, right? So anyway, I'm getting a little bit too excited about this. I better calm down. So the Legislative Assembly is created. They make the Constitution. They make the king sign the Constitution, and the new Constitution, what it does, and they had always intended this. It dissolved the National Assembly, and what comes up in the place of the National Assembly is known as the Legislative Assembly. So the National Assembly was never meant to be a permanent solution for government. It was an interim government while they got the whole Constitution figured out. So from 1791 to 1792, we are now in the official, if you will, constitutional monarchy of France. It lasts for a year. It's a completely new group of legislators that come to power. The National Assembly agreed that when they created a new constitution, the people who were part of the National Assembly would step down from power and not govern when a new constitution was written. And this new government, work on your act, boy, wow, that was just completely uncalled for. I'm putting your name on, I'm going to put your name on. I don't have anything to put your name on. I'm going to put it on right here. You know, your name is on the paper, okay? Because I don't have a board to write it on. All right, here we go. New government, you got me all off track here. The new government of France reflected emergence of political factions. And so this is where we start to see political parties take place. A few moments ago, Chris asked me about who's the Jacobin Club, who are the Girondinists, who are the Sans-Culottes, who are all these people? Well, let's talk about it. The group of the Jacobin Club it's basically a political party of pretty much radicals, and the Girondins are actually a faction of the Jacobin Club. So if you were drawing it on a hierarchy, it would be, you know, the entire legislative assembly, and then you would take and you would divide it into various trees, and you would have the Jacobins and so on, and then a subdivision of the Jacobins was the Girondins, or the Girondists. And basically, the Girondinists, or the Girondists, lead the entire country of France into war. The Jacobins are the largest party in the legislative assembly. I thought I misspoke, but I was correct. The legislative assembly. And one of the things that they do in the legislative assembly is that people sit in this building, and the people who are of the more conservative royalist type people, the people who favor the king, sit more towards the right, okay? So they're more conservative. They sit, you know, if we were to put a color on them, they'd be blue, like, you know, conservative French. And then you've kind of got your French royalists, people who support, not loyalists, royalists who support the monarch. And then you've kind of got your moderates in the middle. And then, so they sit more in the center of this building. And then to the left, you have the really radical folks. And kind of in between, you've got like somewhat people who are like more left-leaning liberals, and then you kind of have people who are a little bit like right-leaning conservatives, but they're somewhat moderates. But then you've got your leftist radicals, the people who want the most change in government. So you got the status quo conservatives over on the right, you've got your really, really radical folks sitting over on the left. Well, the Jacobins are pretty radical. And the Jacobins make up the largest part of the legislative assembly. And the Girondins are the faction of the Jacobins who lead the country into war. And during this time, the country becomes pretty polarized. And there's some very different, anytime that you create a democratic type of system where you have different people, kind of like our country today in some respects. We've got two major political parties in our country, the Democrats and the Republicans. And the Democrats and the Republicans, I think today, probably more so than almost any time in American history, are really polarized. What that means is that they're really far extremist on our views, and I really think that has a lot to do with the American news media outlets. And basically, if you're a Republican, you listen to Fox News. If you're a Democrat, you listen to MSNBC. And that those 24-hour news networks are always preaching to the choir, and it only further radicalizes people in their views, or polarizes people in their views, rather than embracing the idea of centrism, or like reaching across the aisle, as they sometimes call it. And so anyway, I'm gonna continue on here, but basically the same types of things are happening in France, where you have different people who have different visions of what they see happening in France. And some of the people want to get rid of the king entirely, and other people want to have the king be more like he was before, as more of an absolutist type figure. And so different visions means that you're going to get a lot of conflict. The war that starts to take place during this time was a major issue that people had some very different views on how it should be handled. The thing that drags France into the war of what's known as the War of the First Coalition is known as the Declaration of Pillnitz. The Declaration of Pillnitz is a document that was issued by Prussia and Austria in August of 1791. The Declaration of Pillnitz basically says that Leopold of Austria the leader, the Holy Roman Emperor of Austria, is going to take military steps to put down the revolution in France, certainly to limit the extension of the revolution into any other country, but basically to put down the revolution in France. This declaration, though, was basically a bluff. It was a way of getting them to. It was a way of coming out fierce against revolution to prevent something like that happening in their own countries. The French émigrés, E-M-I-G-R-E-S, influenced both countries, Prussia and Austria, to demand a restoration of the French monarchy as their main goal. So the whole idea here is that the Declaration of Pillnitz was an attempt to put down the revolution and get France to restore its own monarch. News for you, that's not ever going to happen. That ship sailed years ago. But the reason that they're doing it is because they don't want the same thing happening in Prussia or in Austria. The declaration was intended to slow down the revolution and rid himself of these emigrants. Now, that term émigrés, if you think there's immigrants and there's emigrants, people who emigrate are leaving a place, people who immigrate are coming to a place. So the French émigrés are people who are leaving France to go live in other places. And these are the people who are, they don't want French people living in their country. It's a nuisance. So that's really the thing that gets them to say this, declare, to have the Declaration of Pillnitz. But in the process, this whole declaration is. Have you ever seen those things that it's called a bellows, where it's like a thing where it has like a little tube at the end and it blows air out of it, and you do it to flame the fire or fuel the fire? That's exactly what this does. And so when he does this, he misjudges greatly the French revolutionary sentiment, and the Republican sentiment in France starts to gain strength in response to this. Now remember, we're still in the constitutional monarchy phase, but what we're going to see happen here is that we're going to move into what's known as the Republican phase, the Rousseau era of the French Revolution, otherwise known as the Reign of Terror. And this Reign of Terror would turn out very, very badly for a lot of people. So in April of 1792, a few months later, what ends up happening is that France declares war on Austria. The Legislative Assembly, under primarily the influence of the Jacobin Club and specifically the Girondinists, or the Girondists, declare war on Austria. And the Girondins become this party that's trying to spread the sentiment of the French Revolution to other places as well. They claimed that the revolution could never be secure in France until all of Europe and perhaps even the entire world had experienced a similar type of revolution. So they're quite radical in terms of their worldview. So the War of the First Coalition lasts for about 5 years, from 1792 to 1797, where you had French revolutionary forces that basically soundly got beat by the Austrian military, because it's really hard for a nation who's basically in turmoil to be able to run an effective war campaign. That being said, the French probably put more of a fight up than the Austrians thought that they were going to. The only conflict between Eastern monarchs over the division of Poland saved France from utter defeat. Only the conflict between Eastern monarchs over the division of Poland saved France from defeat. So the partitions of Poland, we'll talk about that later. Intensified the War of the First Coalition, though, does intensify this existing unrest and dissatisfaction of the unpropertied classes. And the Jacobins, when the French are defeated in the War of the First Coalition, the Jacobins basically blame their defeat on Louis the 16th, who is still alive in 1792, and they believe that he is the one that's like conspiring with Austria and Prussia to help them win the war. There was something called the Brunswick Manifesto, which was issued on July 25th, 1792, which was issued by Prussia and Austria, and this threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed. This Brunswick Manifesto was a mistake. And so in response to the Brunswick Manifesto, the Jacobin Club, the Jacobin mobs, take over Paris, the capital of France. And this revolutionary sentiment is continued to be stoked. The flame continues to grow hotter and brighter by three major people. Maximilien Robespierre is one of them, Georges Danton is another, and Jean-Paul Marat would be the third, which I've talked to you about Marat before. So there are these things that take place called the September Massacres. But really the trouble starts in August beforehand, when the palace that the king was staying in, Tuileries Palace, is stormed, much the same way that the Bastille was stormed, and the king is taken prisoner. And the Swiss guards are defeated. Many are murdered by the Parisian Jacobin mob. And this basically begins the second leg of the revolution, the reign of terror. So they storm Tuileries Palace, they take it over, and so on. What ends up happening is they set up a revolutionary municipal government in France known as the Paris Commune that takes the power from the Legislative Assembly, which basically collapses. And this Paris Commune is led by a guy by the name of Georges Danton, who's this kind of loud, boisterous. He really enjoyed his wine. He was very heavy into the Enlightenment, very charismatic, very well liked by his peers, sort of a guy. And the Legislative Assembly basically obliges the radicals by suspending the 1791 Constitution. So they take this Constitution that they just finished a year ago in 1791, they suspend it. They say, we need to gain control in Paris because the whole thing is going to heck in a handbasket. And so we're going to suspend the Constitution for a while in order to regain control. And we're going to hold new elections based on universal male suffrage for the creation of a Republican government. Now, what is a Republican government? A Republican government, like I was trying to tell you guys in class, is a government that is run by an elected body of representatives. But what this really turns into, much the same way that the Republican government or the Republic of, and I did scare quotes for a reason because it's not an actual republic, the Republic of England or the Commonwealth of England turns into a military dictatorship. And that's the exact same thing that happens in Paris during this Rousseau period of time. So the September massacres are when rumors start spreading after they take the king prisoner that counter-revolutionary nobility and former First Estate clergy were plotting to invade Paris with foreign invaders and mercenary armies. Now, keep in mind, these threats are probably empty, but when you take a situation that is as volatile as it is in France at this time, and you start spreading rumors around, and did you hear this, and did you hear that, and oh, I hear the king's going to do this, oh, I hear the king's going to do that, or nobility's doing this, and then they're teaming up with this, and they're going to let the there's going to be this huge prison break because a lot of these guys have been put in prison and so on. So what they do is that basically mobs slaughter 1,000 priests, bourgeoisie, and aristocrats. And the people who feel that the worst per capita in terms of the most, the most people from a particular group that were killed was actually the First Estate. The clergy, in terms of their numbers, because the clergy was quite small, in terms of their numbers, that has a major effect on you know, there's a lot of them that are killed. So if you ever were to hear like, oh, what group of people face the most deaths during this stage of the Great Terror, or the Great Fear, not the Great Fear, the Reign of Terror, it's the First Estate. The Age of Rousseau is the period of time where this is happening, and there's a new government that's taking place. So the Legislative Assembly collapses, thanks to these September massacres and the events of the August just before it. And they suspend the Constitution. So that whole thing that they spent 2 years working on with the National Assembly, when the National Assembly steps down and they create the Legislative Assembly, is defunct. It's gone. It's gone, and it never comes back. And it's replaced by a new type of government called the National Convention. So we had, just for record, the National Assembly, which was the former Third Estate. They stepped down and they're replaced by the Legislative Assembly under the new Constitution, which lasts for about a year. And then that is dissolved and it's replaced by the Republican government, primarily Jacobin-led, and under the leadership of what's now called the National Convention. And they proclaim France to be a full republic on September 21st, 1792. When this happens, when you have a republic, you are no longer a constitutional monarchy, which means that you no longer have a need for a monarch. And so the monarchy is completely abolished. These are based on the ideals of three things: liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty and equality are two things that you probably know. Liberty, freedom, equality, everybody's equal. And by that I mean mainly male landowners and so on. Although they did give universal male suffrage. So we'll say that all males are equal, but not women. And then fraternity. And if you don't know what fraternity is like, if you've ever heard of a fraternity, like the college fraternities, it's a brotherly love, brotherly organization, brotherly camaraderie sort of thing. Most members of the National Convention are Jacobins and Republicans. And Republicans at this time are considered radical. These are small r Republicans, not big R Republicans. Big R Republicans refers to the American political party known as the Republican Party. That is not the type of Republican that we are talking about. We are talking about small r radical Republicans in France who are opposed to the idea of any sort of monarchy, and that's why it becomes abolished. These are largely going to be your bourgeois people, or well-educated middle to middle upper class type people, or upper middle class. The period of time, so although we talked about the Girondins as being quite radical in the years preceding this, there actually emerges an even more radical group of the Jacobin Club. And so you have the Girondins, they remain. George Danton was part of the Girondins, for instance, and they're the guys that want to spread the revolution to the whole world or whatever. But believe it or not, the Girondins remain more moderate and largely rural. The new faction that emerges is known as the Mountain. And the Mountain is these super urban radical Republicans. And the leaders were Robespierre and Danton, who was previously a Girondinist, and kind of still, George Danton is not as radical as Robespierre, although they're both quite radical. But Robespierre is like the leader of the Mountain, basically. But technically, they both sat on the upper left side of the Assembly Hall because they were the two more radical guys. But of the two, Robespierre, I would say, is more radical. Then you had another group of people that emerged called the Sans-Culottes. The Sans-Culottes, and that's spelled Sansculottes, culotte. And culottes are these pantaloons. That's basically what they are. They're pantaloons. They're these kind of breeches that these guys wear on their pants, on their, basically on the thigh portion of the leg. It's a fashion item at this time. Sans means without. So when you say sans culotte, what you're saying is I don't wear culotte. And what that was an indicator of is that the culottes were worn by primarily kind of upper class folks. If you're sans culotte, that's an indicator that you are not an upper class person. So these are going to be predominantly working class folks, and the sans culottes are extremely radical. Their violence during this time keeps the revolution in this like cyclical forward moving motion, where they continue calling out people and they're putting people to death. They're the ones who were responsible for the storming of the Bastille. They're the ones who were responsible for the march to Versailles. They're the ones that were responsible for storming the Tuileries Palace. They're the ones that were responsible for the September massacres. The sans-culottes are the radical, violent Parisian mobs, which are primarily kind of your working urban class folks who are very influential in the National Assembly. And they're very proud of the fact that they don't wear culottes. They kind of wear like more, what you call it? You can actually see in the game that I was telling you about earlier, Assassin's Creed Unity, you can actually see them, and they wear a very particular type of clothing that kind of looks a little bit like you're wearing rags. Not very nice clothing. It would have been clothing that people would have looked at like, oh, you look like you're, dressed like a bum. But they're proud of the fact that they're urban workers and they're radical revolutionaries. Women, one of the interesting things about women is that they, one of the interesting things about the sans-culotte is that the women played a prominent role in the sans-culotte. So women at this time had more of a place in the sans-culotte than they would have in maybe perhaps other parties. Okay, I'm gonna try and wrap this up here in like the next, about 10 minutes. So I'm going to move quickly through this next stuff because I know I've already been talking now for like over an hour, and I don't want to take up your whole night, but hopefully this has been really helpful for you. So in 1792, the Revolutionary Army wins a couple of victories. In fall of 1792. And by February of 1793, the National Convention widens the War of the First Coalition. And the War of the First Coalition is referring to a coalition, which is always going to, whenever you talk about a coalition, you're talking about a unified force. So it's a force with a bunch of different nations in it. And the First Coalition was made up of the following places: Britain, Holland, Spain, and it already was fighting Austria and Prussia at this time. And so when I told you before that Austria really whooped on the French, that was in the early part of the war. I didn't mean to say that. That was probably a bit misleading. What I meant to say was that when the war first started, the Austrians and the Prussians pretty much walloped the French. That was in the first part of the war. That's while the king's still alive and so on, before everything gets really crazy with but then the war enters a new phase in 1793, because remember, the war starts in 1792, 1790, I think that's 1792, and then it continues all the way up until 1797. So this war encompasses several years. The first part of it, the French kind of get walloped. They kind of come back in 1792, which surprised Prussia and Austria, and in 1793, the very beginning of 1793, January, they execute the king. Louis XVI is executed January 1793 in front of a huge crowd. It's very cold out that morning because it's in the midst of January, and Marie Antoinette's days were numbered. I think she dies later. I don't have the thing up here right now, but I want to say that Marie Antoinette dies after, is put to death after. Yeah, she has to be. So Louis XVI is convicted of treason for collaborating and trying to escape to Austria previously and collaborating with the Prussian and Austrian First Coalition forces to try to secure his reinstatement as monarch of France. He's executed and after being convicted of treason. It was a close vote. He almost didn't get executed, but he does. May 1793, the Mountain, that really strongly radical Republican part of the Jacobin Club, supported by the Sans-Culottes, takes out the Girondins. Louis XVI was heading for trouble. Get it? Get it? Ouch. All right. Believed what the Mountain believed was that the Girondins would ally with conservatives and royalists to retain power in the National Convention. And this probably wouldn't have been the case, but there's an air of paranoia that's enveloping all of France right now. People are freaking out. They don't know who to trust. People are ratting out their neighbors. That people who are even just perceived as not being enthusiastic enough about the French Revolution are subject to be tried and executed for being anti-revolutionary. So you wanted to make sure that you were very vocal publicly about your support of the French Revolution during this time, and more specifically the Mountain and the radical Republicans. Radical working class leaders of Paris seized and arrest the Girondins and leave the Mountain completely into control. The Mountain being the Robespierre-led faction of the Jacobin Club. And the Mountain is even more radical than the Sans-Culottes is. As revolutionary and as violent as the Sans-Culottes was, believe it or not, the Mountain was even more radical. The revolutionary government had finally lost the confidence of much of France, and many Girondins end up leaving Paris during this time and end up trying to control or prevent the craziness that's going on in Paris and working somewhat against the revolution. And Marat ends up getting stabbed with that stiletto knife. Remember, that's not a high heel, that's a stiletto knife, by a woman named Charlotte Corday, who was a supporter of the Girondists, and her brother was called out by pro-Mountain Marat and executed, and so she had a personal grief against him. The Jacobins closed women political clubs by 1794 or so, and then you have this very famous piece that I was telling you about before, which I'm going to show you a picture of right now. I told you about an artist in class today by the name of Jacques-Louis David, and he painted this painting here, The Death of Marat. Marat was the guy who had the skin infection I was telling you about. It's a very famous painting, and it looks like, let me see if I can find a nice bright picture here. All right, it looks like this. Put up the, okay, so this is the image here, the death of Marat, and you can see him here. He's sitting in his bath. He's stabbed several times with this stiletto knife, so there's kind of blood here. And it, definitely, the arm hanging down the side. Some of you might have even seen this image before. This says Marat here. Here's his little table. And like I said, he was always listing out names. You can see Corday's name, Charlotte Corday. Her name is right here on the paper that he's holding in his hand. And this is a very, with the wounds, the bleeding wounds, the position of his arm, the expression on his face is purposefully trying to draw attention to or make a connection with Christ-like sentimentality. Jacques Louis David, pro-Enlightenment thinker, pro-revolutionary artist, is definitely trying to draw a comparison between the kind of inflammatory sentiments of the French Revolution and this Christ-like martyrdom of Marat, and paint that together. So it was intentional, the reason that was painted that way. So at any rate, there's this organization that forms. I'm almost done here today. I really appreciate you guys sticking through. I can see how many people are in here, and we still have 40 full viewers, and that's like a full class. So you guys are troopers, and I really appreciate you sticking it through this whole way. I'm almost done. I'm going to talk about a last couple of things here, and then we'll be finished. The Committee of Public Safety is a small inner circle of basically Robespierre's closest buddies, and the Committee of Public Safety. Sorry, I wanted to bring up, just in case you guys had any questions. The Committee of Public Safety, Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer by trade, and he was extremely well spoken. He was a perfectionist, and they nicknamed, this is a kind of ironic nickname, they called him the Incorruptible. The Incorruptible. He was a guy who never had a hair out of place. He was, he was one of those guys, cross your T's, dot your I's, perfectionist. And they called him the Incorruptible because he had this air about him where he was very convincing, and was he, believe it or not, he actually started off anti-death penalty. He was a very big fan of Beccaриa's work, Cesar Beccaria, the guy who wrote all of those predictable, there should be like a predictable due process, and we should get rid of cruel and unusual punishments and things like that. He was actually anti-death penalty. He was anti-capital punishment. Robespierre was. And this is the guy who ends up being single-handedly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people in France because of this really, really radical period of time known as the Reign of Terror, under the leadership of the Committee of Public Safety. So it's this emergency government, this inner circle of the mountain that that is dealing with the quote-unquote external challenges to the revolution, external really and internal challenges of the revolution. Anyone who is perceived as not being pro-revolutionary was liable to be executed. And so they collaborated a lot of times with Jean-Paul Marat until his death, and the sans-culottes. The law of maximum was passed during this time. This was a planned economy, basically a command economy to respond to food shortages and related. The economic problems that they were facing were not improved by the fact that they went to war against the First Coalition. That did not help their case in terms of their economy, and they still have a bread shortage at this time. So this is like an emergency government to deal with those problems. And they're thinking that this law of maximum would enable France to wage war against its enemies, allow prices and so on for key products to be fixed, fix the price of bread so poor folks could afford it, things like that. And so then the government nationalizes some of these workshops and takes raw materials and grain from peasants so that they can fuel this command economy. It's almost like trying to institute a quasi like communist. I hate using that to compare because communism technically isn't invented yet, but it's basically an early form of communist government where they're trying to institute this command economy where they're controlling the amount of bread that's produced and grain and the prices that they're at and supply and demand and all these things. They're trying to have it be government controlled. They abolished slavery at this time. One of the few places that France holds in the New World still at this time is an island that's today known as Haiti, but at the time was known as Saint-Domingue. and Saint-Domingue, they abolished slavery. The funny thing is that Napoleon tries to reinstitute slavery, and that goes over very, very poorly. And so, anyway, I'll just skip over that. The Reign of Terror during this time is in full effect by July of 1794. And you have the Austrian Netherlands and so on that start to be controlled by France. The planned economy starts to make mobilization of their troops or positioning of their troops a little bit more effective and be able to feed their troops and so on. Nationalism is this strong force that's uniting the French people under a single flag, which at this time would have been the tricolore, that French flag, the classic red, white, and blue French flag. And so some military victories during this time lead to a relaxed control, but the Reign of Terror still went on. And so the most notorious event of the entire revolution is this Reign of Terror. And there was another law passed called the Law of Suspect, where any alleged enemies of the revolution were brought before these revolutionary tribunals. I mean, they could be tried in the morning, sentenced to execution, and guillotined by the afternoon time at the height of the Reign of Terror. And this was basically instituted as a way of making sure that the revolution continues moving forward. So about 40,000 people during this time, during these 2 years, 40,000 people are executed by way of guillotine, which is that contraption where the blade falls and cuts your head off. I think I told one of the classes today about the guy who was really interested in the blinking. And so there was a situation where a guy knew a guy who was going to be beheaded. They asked him to blink, and after his head was severed, to blink for as long as he could, and it lasted the blinking lasted for a full 9 seconds, which is I mean, it's a pretty long time to be awake after your head is removed from your body, in case, but I probably couldn't really see anything because your blood's not pumping to the head, so it's kind of loss of oxygen. I bet they couldn't really see much, or at least I would hope not. It sounds pretty grim. But the terror becomes this political weapon that's used that's not really aimed at any particular group of people. Of the people that are executed, 70% are peasants and workers. I want to stress something here. Peasants and workers make up the majority of the society. So in terms of that number, if you're asking the brute number of people that died, it's the peasants. If you're asking per capita, the number of people that died, particularly in the early part of the revolution, it's the clergy. There's a number of clergy members that are killed. Because the clergy is such a small group that it doesn't take as many deaths of the clergy to jack that number up. Most deaths occurred in places in open revolt against the convention, such as an area of France, of Western France, known as Vendée, Vendee. Another 300,000 that aren't executed are imprisoned. And so it's quite a scary time in France. They nicknamed the guillotine the national razor. So if you were like shaving you didn't want to shave with the national razor. That was too close of a shave, if you will. And by too close of a shave, I meant you wouldn't be growing a beard very well after that shave. So anyway. I think we're going to wrap things up there. That allows me to get a little bit ahead in the notes. We don't have a whole lot left here, but I hope you've enjoyed our lecture, our hour-and-a-half long lecture. That's like 3.5 hours of Euro that you guys have had today, and I really appreciate you guys sticking it through and dedicating your time to listening to this. So will there be a review session tomorrow morning? You bet there will be. I will be at school bright and early tomorrow morning, 6:30 a.m., and we will have a study session. I have a number of AP Human Geo kids that are coming to that, so I don't know how much individualized help I'll be able to give, but I will be there. Also, can we, after these online video sessions for I'm not, Samir, I'm not really sure what the second part of your question meant. All right. Well, my opinion on War Thunder is that it's a good game, but it's frustrating, and I haven't played it for quite a while. But if there's no other questions related to the French Revolution, I'm going to let you guys go. It's 6:30 here, so I appreciate all of you guys contributing and listening, and I will see you potentially tomorrow morning or on Friday night.